Welcome, 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 welcome. We are live. We are live. Welcome, welcome, welcome to everybody. We are live. Part of our continuing series where we talk to reporters, writers, activists, authors, anybody on the left, anybody on the right, as long as they can form complete thoughts. And we want to present them unedited and unaltered directly to you, the public, so that you could do this thing that was popular when I was in high school called thinking for yourself. Maybe it'll come back, maybe it won't. With us, it is our privilege to have Anthony Fowler. He's a professor at the University of Chicago, Harris School of Public Policy.
Thank you so much, Marcus. It's great to be here. Can I plug something really quick just because you reminded me of it, which
Plug
is
away.
I'm an author of a book called Thinking Clearly with Data. So I very much believe in thinking for yourself. For whatever reason, a lot of elite academics they think, oh, well, we need to tell people what to think, and that's not my view at all. My view is we should teach people to think for themselves so that they can confront new problems and so forth. And so I appreciate that introduction a lot. I'm happy to be here.
I love that you said that because I don't always pick that up. I'm not saying so. I just get a slight feeling. I can't say that we're the academics. We know you guys should just accept what we say. And here's an academic saying, well, actually, no. Our role is to get you guys to ask more questions and think. That's awesome. I love hearing that. Anthony Fowler, professor of the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago. His research applies econometric methods for causal. His research applies econometric methods for causal inference to questions in political science, with particular emphasis on elections and political representation. Specific interests include unequal political participation, electoral selection and incentives, political polarization, and the credibility of empirical research. He is editor-in-chief of the Quarterly Journal of Political Science and author of Thinking Clearly with Data, the great book we just heard about, and a host of Not Another Politics podcast. Good title. Let's see here. Some of the work he's worked on is forthcoming is effective polarization driven by identity, loyalty, or substance. American Moderates in the American Political Science Review. Updating amidst disagreement, new experimental evidence on partisan cues. Distinguishing between false positives and genuine results in the case of irrelevant events and elections, and information-based explanation for partisan media sorting. So a lot of research on political polarization, identity, and sorting in the electorate. Just give me 1 second here. We already covered some of those. This is some of the work that the professor's been part of. Moderates. Updating amidst disagreement, new experimental evidence on partisan cues. Do primary elections exacerbate congressional polarization, partisan intoxication, or policy voting? Causes and consequences of increasingly co-partisan constituencies. So a lot of research looking at how did we get here? Why are people doing this? But before we get to that, let's check in first and see how well we did. Professor, did I say anything wrong? Do we need to correct anything for the record before we start?
No, that sounds great. I appreciate the introduction.
Okay. Let's go right to it then. So a lot of the work you've done, 2023, 2022, 2020, why did you start looking at political polarization? And before you answer, if you could answer both as an academic and just as an American with two working eyeballs, and pretend that I've been in a cave the last 5 to 7 years. Why are you looking at political polarization? Seems like you're doing a lot of studying at the last couple of years.
Sure.
Is it a relevant topic? What's going on in America? Why is this worth looking at?
Sure. Yeah, I study elections and politics, and mostly the U.S., also some other advanced democracies. And polarization is a big topic of investigation in that area because it seems like it's so salient. It seems to kind of be pervasive throughout the political system. One, we have pretty good data, for example, on how members of Congress vote. We can look at their roll call votes and so forth. And by that measure, it looks like polarization in Congress continues to rise over time. For the last 50 years or so, there's just been a steady, almost linear, dramatic increase in polarization, with Democrats becoming more liberal, Republicans becoming more conservative, and fewer members of Congress anywhere in that middle. And so there's been a big debate among political scientists about why that's going on. Why does it seem like the elites are so polarized and the candidates on offer seem to be so far apart from each other? At the same time, it looks like the American public is not nearly as polarized. And there's, of course, lots of debates about that as well. But in general, most Americans seem to be somewhere in the middle. You get kind of a nice unimodal distribution of ideology if you look at the general public, and they're not nearly as polarized as members of Congress. And so I think of that as one of the most interesting puzzles in American politics today, which is that the elites and the candidates are very polarized. The general public is not especially polarized. And so why is that? And I don't have all the answers to that, but I'm certainly interested in that puzzle. And that's partly why I've been doing a lot of studies on that topic.
I've heard this, that you could go back to the 1970s. Somewhere in the 1970s, it looked like Congress started being polarized. And then that was the case. And then somewhere in the 1990s, you started hearing arguments that maybe the people are starting to become polarized themselves. The debate, as I've always said, is encapsulated between Morris Fiorina and Alan Abramowitz, I believe, Professor Abramowitz and Professor Fiorina. Fiorina says, I believe, going back since 2008, hey, the people aren't that polarized. If we look at national surveys, a lot of the public seems to have a similar opinion on certain issues, so we can conclude they're not as polarized. Abramowitz is just as educated and versed, and he completely disagrees. Why is there debate on if the public is polarized or not? You had mentioned that there is some debate. What is the debate? Why is there debate? Why don't we have an agreement yet amongst academics on if the public is polarized or not?
Yeah, some of it just has to do with different measures. And so my understanding of the Fiorina-Abramowitz debate is that they're largely talking past each other. They're largely looking at different measures. Fiorina is looking at the distribution of public opinion and saying, look, the share of people with extreme views isn't changing a whole lot over time. And that's confirmed by lots of other sources of data as well. That the moderates paper and abstract that you have up there on the screen right now, one of the key findings in that paper is if we look at people's policy positions, you get more or less a normal distribution. You get most people who are close to the mean. You don't find an especially polarized distribution of public opinion like you would if you looked at Congress. So if you look at the general public, the distribution of ideology doesn't seem like there are two poles of liberals and conservatives who hate each other and disagree on everything. It looks like most people are somewhere in the middle. Abramowitz has pointed out that the gap between self-identified Democrats and Republicans has grown over time. And that could be that people are increasingly sorting into the parties according to their policy positions. It could be that people they could potentially be changing their policy positions in response to their party identity, although there's probably only modest evidence for that kind of thing. So in any case, they're just looking at two different measures. And by the Abramowitz measure, there is a slight increase in the distance between Democrats and Republicans. But by the Fiorina measure, people don't disagree by that much, actually. And that's confirmed in other work as well. Will Howell and I wrote this paper on partisan cues. And one of the things that we did in that paper is we just asked people these very continuous questions. So instead of, we often ask in surveys these very binary questions that are intended to divide people between liberals and conservatives. But most people might have a position somewhere in the middle and they're torn. And so what if we just ask people in a more continuous way, something like, what do you think the federal minimum wage should be? Tell me any number, whatever number you think. You could say we should leave it at $7.25. You could say 15. You could say 25. You could say 0. We shouldn't have a minimum wage. And when you look at those answers, most people give kind of sensible, moderate answers. Most people think it should be higher than $7.25. Most people think it shouldn't be as high as $15. It should, you get a lot of people giving answers in that $10, $11, $12 range. And in fact, Democrats and Republicans aren't even that far apart. Maybe the median Democrat thinks it should be $12 and the median Republican thinks it should be $10. So I think if you just look at what people actually think on policy questions, you don't find that the general public is particularly polarized or extreme.
Most of the public, Right, like there is some extreme wings, but the majority of
Exactly.
the
Yes,
public, where the left or right, kind of lumps in the center on at
exactly.
least some of these major policy questions. So when we hear the idea of we can't get along, we can't pass any legislation, it's like, well, no, most Americans want reasonable gun safety regulations, and most Americans want their children safe from shootings at school, and most Americans believe women should have some access to choose.
I think
How
that's
does
exactly right. And you're also right about the tails. I mean, of course, there are extremists on the tail. So there are some small number of people with very extreme views. And those people are overrepresented in the national discourse, right? The extremists there have particularly loud voices on social media and on cable news and so forth. And so I think a lot of regular Americans think that there are more extremists out there than there really are because those voices tend to be amplified. And there's nobody who's screaming on social media about how we should have a $10 minimum wage. So, so, which makes sense, makes a lot of sense. But if you just go out and, go out and talk to regular Americans, you'll find that most people have moderate positions on most issues, and they're not very happy with either major political party.
fair enough, fair enough. Uh, but it is also fair to say that what Abramowitz is talking about is also true, that there is a gap between self-identified Republicans and Democrats that's growing larger. I believe the term's affective polarization. We can see people just hate the other side more. That has been going up clearly over the last 10 to 15, 20 years. And that could be identified as sorting. So maybe people have similar ideas on policy, but they seem to be growing increasingly angry at the other side for whatever reason. Would that be a fair summation, Professor?
You're right. There is a lot of evidence on this affective polarization. If you ask people, how warmly do you feel toward Democrats and Republicans? The gap in those answers seems to be growing over time. And there is a big gap. A lot of Democrats say they really don't feel warmly toward Republicans, and vice versa, Republicans don't feel warmly toward Democrats. Um, so that's all true. There's a part of me that wonders whether the evidence on that is somewhat overstated or whether or not we make too big of a deal of that because these responses always come from political surveys where you just ask me a bunch of political questions and then you ask me what do I think of Republicans if I'm a Democrat, and of course I say of course I hate the Republicans, but
Right.
then that night I go have dinner with my friend Steve, who's a Republican, and we have a great time, and we talk about things, and we disagree on some things, we agree on other things, and we get along just fine. So I wonder if some of that is overstated. Some of that is a byproduct of political surveys where people are giving particularly partisan answers. We know that we have lots of evidence of what's called partisan cheerleading, where people give more partisan answers in surveys than really reflect their genuine preferences or beliefs. And so, for example, if you ask someone a factual question like, how bad is inflation right now? You'll get a bunch of Democrats that say, oh, it's not very bad. And you'll get Republicans that say it's really bad. And then if you pay them to get the right answer, their answers come together. And it turns out they actually more or less agree on the facts. They're just inflating their true views to give the more kind of fun, more partisan answer in the survey. So all of that's to say that I wonder sometimes if we make too big of a deal of these measures, because the vast majority of Americans that I talk to, they're friends with people from the other party, and they have moderate policy positions, and they don't walk around thinking to themselves, I'm a Democrat and I hate Republicans, and vice versa. But there is, of course, some of that. I think there are some extremists who do feel that way. And I think the other thing to say about that is that a lot of the evidence on affective polarization suggests that it's really driven by policy preferences and policy disagreements. Like, I feel strongly about abortion and I really disagree strongly with these other people. And it's not driven by some other kind of identity based, I just hate that other team. And so I think that's interesting. And I just wonder if we make too big of a deal of that because most Americans are ideological moderates, and a lot of these studies even ignore the large share of people who are independents who don't identify as either Democrats or Republicans. My own view is that polarization is not a big problem in the general public in the United States, but it does seem to be a big problem, or at least a big phenomenon among our elected officials and our elites.
That's what Fiorina said. I saw a debate where they were saying, "Well, what about these surveys showing people are upset with each other?" And he goes, "Well, why?" It was specifically on the dating one. So there's a survey showing that You go back to 2012, about 30% of the population would not want to date someone outside their political party. Now it's over half. It's the majority of Americans won't date someone out of the political party. And his response was, well, I think that's overstated. Maybe people want to be more political than they want. But the question for me is that's not the only thing. We have people talking about their polarizing and sorting into different red and blue universities. There's a lot of evidence for that. The Atlantic magazine is talking about how they did a review. People won't marry each other. Time magazine did the dating survey. That's the one Fiorina kind of doubted, but I'm like, why can we doubt their survey? I mean, how do we know they didn't do it right? And then my favorite one is this, which shows this was out during the middle of COVID, but it does show that you have a huge divide where 74% of Biden voters and 78% of Trump voters feel voters from the other party are a clear and present danger to the USA, was the term. These seem to be measures of people not getting along across America that aren't specifically looking at how they feel on policy preferences. Additionally, we've also interviewed a lot of people who said in their personal lives, they've straight up lost friends and family and it never came back. How can all these things fit together in one reality?
I mean, I think it's probably a combination of factors. I think some of this is genuine. I think there are some extremists out there who have very strong views, and they really don't talk to members of the other party and so forth. But I suspect that's a small share of the American electorate. So I think that's part of it. I think part of it is that people are giving overly partisan answers in surveys that don't genuinely reflect how they really think. You ask someone, do you really want your child to marry someone from the other party? You say no in a survey, but then when the time comes to actually, your child brings someone home and they're interested in marrying them, political party is going to be, the 37th thing that you care about. You're going to care about a lot of other things before you care about political party. So I do wonder if political surveys, if people come across more partisan than they really are in the context of a political survey. So I suspect it's a combination of all of these things, that there's some truth to it, but also it's overstated. And if you just talk to regular Americans, they're not nearly as partisan as you would think if you only paid attention to social media or cable news or these headlines from political studies.
All the interviews that we did with people that I've done were not through that. There was like personal interviews. I interviewed about 20, 30 professors across the Midwest and South. All of them indicated it happened in their personal lives. In addition, there's 4 or 5 measures here that aren't surveys and seem to show that. But it just gets to the question. I've also heard that there's also a preference documented by some people who study polls that people may want to give answers that seem that's what the pollster would want to hear. So, hey, I'm doing a poll on racism. Are you a white supremacist racist? Of course I'm not. I'm not going to admit that. I am, but I don't want to say that. I don't want to say that horrible thing. So could it be possible that when we look at polls that show a uniformity of opinion on certain policy issues, that there might be the opposite bias, that people are saying, well, I don't want to appear too far out of whack. I don't want to seem like a wacko, a radical, a fringe member. So I'm going to say my opinion is X because I think that's what most people feel about guns, and I don't want to stand out. And so we would have biases in the survey showing that there's conformity of opinion on policies. Would that theoretically also be possible with those surveys?
It's certainly possible. I mean, we talk about social desirability bias a lot when we design any kind of political study. Are people changing their answers because they know what's being studied, or because they're worried about how they're going to be perceived by the researcher and so forth? So I think you're absolutely right that certain extreme views people would have an incentive to downplay and say that's not really my view. But I think there could be other views where people have an incentive to kind of overstate the extent to which they share some particularly strong view. There's certainly a reputation that academic researchers are pretty extreme relative to the general public. So you could imagine if anything, maybe people feel an incentive to say, oh no, I'm just as progressive as the researchers doing the study. So you're right. I mean these are concerns, and I think for any individual study, I think you'd want to work hard to make sure you design the study in a way that the subjects maybe don't know exactly who's doing the study and why you're doing the study, and you're working hard to elicit their genuine views. But you're absolutely right; these are thorny issues. But my sense from looking at lots of different data sources is that most Americans have reasonably moderate political positions. And of course, we often design the questions in a way to make it look like the public is divided. We ask a binary question: do you support or oppose this policy? And if you ask a pollster, suppose you got a question back that said 95% of people agreed on something, they would say that wasn't a good question. You should change the wording until you get division between the liberals and the conservatives. So I think on net, that's probably a bigger concern, is that we're overstating division rather than understating it. But you can imagine different studies that make different kinds of mistakes in different directions.
Just want to say I've heard that from Jeremy Zogby. He's the son of John Zogby, the famous polling institution. We did an interview with him, and he literally said what you said. You can make polls to try to find if there's commonality with people, or you can make them divisive. And one of the biggest, easiest tricks is if you ask 2 questions or 3. Is it A or B? Well, now I got to pick a side. Is it A or B or C? Oh, so there's a third option. That doesn't mean I have to view myself as opposite of you. And it said, if you look at a lot of the polls on polarization, they only ask 2 questions. It's a dichotomy. It only gives you the option to go, I'm for it or I'm against it. There's not like 4 or 5 answers, and you have to think, well, I want to position myself opposite. Where do I really feel? And it says you can do that with polls. So absolutely, we can have more polls that seem to push people apart. The question for me, though, is that I know Morris Fiorina has been saying the public is not as polarized as Congress. He's been saying that since 2008. And, the Trump period was pretty bad. A lot of people talking about how they lost friends during the Trump era across America. And I've talked to them personally. And January 6th, wow, that was scary. Can we say that people aren't polarized when we have things like January 6th being pulled off? I mean, that was the people, right?
It was the people, but it was a very small fraction of people. I mean, I wouldn't infer much from January 6th about overall public opinion in America. There was a very small segment of Americans who believed the election was stolen, and they felt strongly enough to go march on Washington. And probably, to be honest, even among the subset of people, there at January 6th, most of those people didn't really, they weren't trying to overthrow the government, or weren't really, now of course it was terrible what happened. I'm not trying to defend
Sure,
what
sure,
happened or
sure.
explain it away, but I wouldn't infer from January 6th that, oh, there's a massive subset of Americans who have such extreme views that they don't even trust democracy and they want to overthrow the government. It was a very small group of people that of course behaved in an inappropriate way, and it was bad that it happened, and we had a major security failure. So there's lots to say about January 6th, but I wouldn't infer much about the state of public polarization just from the actions of a small number of people.
What about the fact that the Republican Party condemned it and then walked back their condemnation, and that the majority of the Republicans are okay with that? I mean, that's 1 or 2 national parties. You basically had them walk it back, and the politicians who walked it back are still in power. That's a huge section of American population to do that.
I don't know. My sense is not. My sense is that the majority of the Republican Party, both the kind of the voting members and the elites, they weren't happy about what happened on January 6th. Mike Pence did not go along with Trump's request to try to block the election. Various Republican secretaries of state did not go along with Trump's request to not certify the election results in their state. So that's good. That's reassuring. I think one thing that we learned from the Trump presidency that was reassuring was that our institutions are perhaps more resistant than we thought to a president with autocratic leanings who tried to subvert the democratic system. And so all of that's mostly good news about the political system kind of worked the way it was supposed to work, despite the fact that you're going to have extreme selfish politicians who are not necessarily acting in the best interests of the nation as a whole. So I don't know if that's right to say that the Republican Party as a whole has behaved in really inappropriate ways. Of course, you could point to individual people and say, and of course, I mean, like I said before, the elites are pretty extreme on both sides, and so you can definitely point to elites who behaved inappropriately. But I don't know if it's fair to say that the Republican Party as a whole endorsed January 6th or was fine with it or walked back their criticism of it. And maybe, yeah, maybe it's not very interesting to get too detailed into the semantics, because I agree with the larger point that our elites are in fact too polarized, and they
Well,
are out of touch with regular Americans. And to the extent that you care about dyadic representation in that way, that's a bit of a problem. That's concerning. But I'm not sure. Again, I don't want to overgeneralize from January 6th and say there's clearly a problem with democracy because a small group of people did this terrible thing.
okay, okay. Yeah, not everybody entered the building. There's only a couple thousand there, but to my knowledge, it was a big chunk, if not majority, the Republican Party, certainly the leadership in Congress right now, did that, and they're still there, and there hasn't been a successful push to move them. But I don't want to get bogged down. Moderates. Are moderates the solution to political polarization? I've heard from some professors that moderates and independents could be the magic solution. I've also heard moderates and independents are just people who say they're independent. Really, when it comes voting time, they fall into line with their party. If there's an extreme position, they'll vote for it too. It's really, they just don't want to call themselves Republicans or Democrats so that they can, because they're tired of being called out in society. Oh, you're a Republican, now I got to argue with you. So they just don't broadcast it, but they still have those same opinions. They still watch the same TV shows. Voting time, they still vote in line with them. Can we really rely on moderates and independents? Additionally, there's some evidence saying, oh, let's get the moderates and independents more involved. They'll save America. There's a lot of social scientific research that says the more involved you get in politics, the more likely you are to become an extremist and a partisan. So knowing that, are moderates and independents truly moderate and independent? And can we rest upon them as the saviors of our democracy, or will we turn them into boogeymen by doing so?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that was, a lot of that was part of the motivation for writing this study. We know that there are lots of people who self-identify as independent or don't want to identify with either major political party. And if you ask, if you just ask, are you liberal, moderate, or conservative? They say, I'm moderate. Furthermore, we know that there are a lot of people who, if you ask them a bunch of policy questions, they might give roughly half liberal answers and half conservative answers. They're kind of, on average, they look ideologically moderate. And there's a debate among political scientists about why is that? Well, who are these people? Some people think, oh, maybe they really are closet partisans who just don't want to reveal that they're really partisan. Maybe they're conflicted extremists. Maybe they have really extreme liberal views on some issues and extreme conservative views on other issues, and they average out to being moderate, even though they're not really moderate on any given issue. Or it could be they're just not paying attention to the survey. You can imagine all kinds of reasons why you might
Yeah.
look like a moderate even though you're not. And so part of our motivation was, can we adjudicate between those different explanations? And so that's what we sought out to do. We said, among these people who are giving a mix of liberal and conservative responses to policy questions, can we figure out how many of them are doing that because they really are ideological moderates? They're actually somewhere in the middle on most policy questions, as opposed to they're just conflicted extremists with no discernible pattern in their responses, or they're actually just they're not paying attention to the survey and they're as if they're flipping coins. And it's somewhat technical paper, so maybe you don't want to get into all the details about how we do this, but the answer seems to be that most survey respondents are well summarized by a single ideological dimension. Most of them are behaving as if they have a one-dimensional ideology. And so if I know your position across, if I know your kind of average ideology, I can do a pretty good job predicting your position across a range of issues. And if we look among those people who are well summarized by that single ideological dimension, you get more or less a unimodal normal distribution of ideology, with most people pretty close to the mean. And so most of the people who look like moderates in other political surveys probably really are moderate. If you ask them what minimum wage do you want, they would give you some number in between what Nancy Pelosi and Mitch McConnell want. And if you ask them what should the tax rates be, the same thing. And if you went down the line, and of course we don't usually ask those kinds of continuous questions, but if we did, that's probably what we would get. because it looks like, depending on the nature of the question, people answer in either the liberal or conservative way, depending on exactly how the question is asked and how popular the liberal or conservative answer is. So most people who seem moderate or independent probably are actually genuinely in the middle. Now, a lot of them might still vote for the same party in a lot of elections because the parties are so far apart from each other. So if I'm a slight liberal, it would take a lot for me to vote for Donald Trump over Joe Biden because Trump and Biden are just so far apart from each other on policy. And so there might be a lot of people who usually vote for the same party and do so fairly consistently across elections. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they agree with that party wholeheartedly on everything. They might actually be a moderate liberal, but they're voting for the Democrats on everything because the Democrats and Republicans are just so far apart from each other.
So even if you're moderate, even if you're middle of the road, you may be forced to vote extremist or extreme left or right because that's the only options that are in town. That's
Yes,
all there is to vote. So
that's
there's
absolutely.
a limit to how much juice we can soak out of being a moderate simply by the system blocking.
I think that's right, and that's part of the interesting puzzle here, which is that moderates. There are a lot of those moderates out there. It looks like they exist. They're real. It also looks like they do vote for the moderate candidate when given the option, and that's something we study in this paper. So when there is a relatively moderate congressional candidate, that candidate tends to win, and it's particularly the moderate voters who support that candidate. Sorry, one second, my phone's ringing here.
No
Um,
problem.
it's typically the moderate voters who support that relatively moderate candidate. So they're the ones that are driving selection and incentives. They're the ones who are determining who wins and loses elections because they're willing to change who they support in elections. But the reason that we still mostly have extremists in Congress is because almost all of the candidates on offer are ideological extremists.
Right. Right. There was I think Abramowitz, I could be getting it wrong. One of them said literally what you're saying, and they were pointing at the Ross Perot election. And they're saying Perot appeared to be a moderate. Whether you agree or not, this is just historians looking back at the time. Ross Perot appeared to be a moderate between Bill Clinton and George H.W. Bush. And there were a lot of moderate votes who came out and very enthusiastically supported him. However, since he's been gone, you really haven't seen moderates come out as effectively as the people on the left or right extremes. Some of the thinking is because there hasn't been another moderate candidate who was even allowed. Perot wasn't even officially brought into the election. He kind of punched his way into the election and inserted himself in there because he understood the power of cable news. So it's not like the system said, oh, we'll have a third party. He came in on his own through sheer will. We haven't had a moderate candidate since then. So I've heard people say that if you actually provided moderate options, moderates would come forward. The problem is it's hard to get somebody who's an actual moderate up to the point where you can vote on them just because of the way the party system works. We're so polarized and bifurcated. And most of the people who are really involved in a political party are super partisan themselves. And you need those people to call voters and donate and hype up your election. And so you really need super energized people who are very political to help you even get off the ground as a candidate. And because of that, most of the candidates are starting off with surrounded by extremists, whether it's on the left or it's on the right, just to get their name out there so they can even start. And if theoretically you could get a moderate to do the same, well, maybe it'd be different, but it's hard to get a moderate candidate to get past the party system. How do you feel about that theory?
Yeah, I agree with that. That rings true to me. That makes a lot of sense. I think it's hard to get a moderate to even want to run for office to begin with because it's just not a very pleasant job. A typical member of Congress spends so much of their time campaigning and raising money. They're not actually spending a lot of time working on policy and trying to make a difference. And so if you are a high, if you're suppose you're a partner at a law firm or you're a successful business person or whatever it is, it would take a lot for you to give that up and run for office. And it tends to be the people with extreme views that are willing to do it. And people with moderate views say that's probably not worth the hassle. It's not worth my time. So I think that all of that's absolutely right. And then even conditional on wanting to run for office, it probably is hard to get through that partisan system. It's hard to get support from important party leaders and so forth if you're not dyed in the wool orthodox partisan in the way that they want you to be. And then your other option would be to run as a third party candidate, and you could run as a third party candidate, but then the voters have to solve this coordination problem, which is people aren't going to vote for you unless they think their vote is likely to make a difference. And if I think that candidate isn't viable, and so that's a whole other challenge that's a result of our electoral system that we have. So I think that those are big challenges for sure. But there is definitely an appetite for moderate candidates in the electorate, and when moderate candidates do manage to get on the ballot, they tend to do very well. It's just that we don't see very many of them. So
Yeah.
there is an opportunity there. And if there are moderates out there who are trying to start a movement, I think they could be very successful. Actually, I think they could win a lot of elections and impact policy in a big way. But it would require significant effort to coordinate and actually recruit candidates and so forth, and try to convince people to pursue that, which is an uphill battle.
How big are the moderates in the voting base? 12%. I've heard maybe 40%. They could save America. I've heard, nah, it's, 20%. They can't save America. How big are they? Can they save us? And let's say they're there and they're big enough. How do we, if you had a magic wand, something I always do I ask professors, if you had a magic wand and you could just wave the magic wand and everybody in America had to think the way you wanted to think, all laws you wanted passed were passed, what would we have to do to have a system where more moderates were running and actually getting to the top of the heap and being able to be voted on? So how big is this group? Can they save us? And what changes do we need in the system to allow them to save us?
Okay, that's a lot of tricky questions. So how many
Sorry.
moderates? No, it's okay. Those are great. Those are great questions. So how many moderates are there? It's somewhat ill defined because it's not like there's a discrete coarse category of once you're below this threshold you're a moderate.
Right.
What I can say from our paper is that you get this continuous distribution of ideology that looks fairly unimodal. It looks kind of like a normal distribution. For a normal distribution, you have something like 68% of the observations are within one standard deviation of the mean. And so, that's pretty close to what ideology actually looks like in America. Maybe it's not exactly a normal distribution, but it's close. So it's hard to say X percent are moderates, but most people are close to the average. And if as a rule of thumb, if you went by the normal distribution numbers, you wouldn't be too far off. So it's 68%, and that's just kind of like a mathematical rule that 68% is within one standard deviation of the mean for a normal distribution, and that's more or less what you get of American ideology. But again, it's hard to pin a particular number on it. There are people who have tried to actually connect regular voters and regular citizens with members of Congress. If you try to ask what share of people have policy positions that are somewhere in between Nancy Pelosi and Mitch McConnell, I don't have a really good answer for you right away off the top of my head, but I think it's a lot. It's more than 90% of Americans would probably be to the right of Nancy Pelosi and to the left of Mitch McConnell.
I've heard some different theories. One was I heard moderates are the biggest selection of voters out there. Problem is, when you add the wings up, they're bigger than the moderates. So yeah, you got only 30% are extremists on the left, 30% extremists on the right, but the moderates outnumber them, but not when the extremists get together and dominate the whole system. I've also heard the moderates are, only 15, 20%. So I'm not, what do you feel they are? Like, is this a huge group of Americans that we're talking about? Is this another fringe movement similar in size to the right wing and the left wing? Or are we really talking about like how Richard Nixon kind of hinted at when the silent majority, it's really is the biggest dominant voting bloc, maybe not over half the population, but bigger than the other voting blocs. How big is this group of people? Because I see wildly different estimates.
I think again, it's hard to, we're just kind of, it's hard to draw the line and say, this is what makes you a moderate. Obviously we've got this, policy positions are continuous and multidimensional and so forth. But I think the silent majority language rings true to me when I look at the evidence. That seems more or less right. That the majority of Americans are certainly, to the right of Democrats in Congress and to the left of Republicans in Congress, and generally unhappy with the offerings of both major political parties. They would certainly like some things to change, but they would like things to be, not change as drastically as some people want them to, and so forth. So I think it's a big share. They are underrepresented in a lot of ways. So moderates are less likely to vote than extremists. They're less likely to give money in elections, obviously. They're less likely to be, on social media discussing politics. They're less likely to be in the newsrooms. They're less likely to be, working for polling organizations and so forth. So I think they are underrepresented in lots of ways, and they're certainly less likely to be in Congress, on congressional staffs, in party conventions, all of that. So you're certainly right that the extremists seem to dominate political discourse and they dominate the policy making process. But I think the silent majority language is probably useful for describing what the data looks like.
That's interesting. That's interesting. Yeah. What about independents? Are independents the same thing as moderates? Are they different?
I think more or less that's true. That people who self-identify as independents are generally politically moderate. There could be some rare exceptions of people who maybe they're actually to the left of the Democratic Party, and so they say they're not Democrats because they're so far to the left of the Democrats. But that's probably a very small share of Americans, and we confirm that in our data, that when we try to identify who those genuine moderates are, they're much more likely to self-identify as independents in surveys. They're also much more likely to self-identify as moderates in surveys. So these self-reports of ideology and partisanship are reasonably accurate and pretty consistent with people's policy positions.
Okay. Let's say there's a big chunk of moderates, a big chunk of independents, but like we said, for whatever reason, they still ended up voting along with their extremist party options. If you had the power of a god and you could take a magic wand and poof, I made these changes in Congress, and poof, I changed the hearts and minds of Americans to feel this way. So you have a society and design it. What do we need to happen legislatively and also with the hearts and minds of the American people to have a system that allows moderates to boil up to the top?
Yeah, those are great questions. As a political scientist, I don't have any desire to change the hearts and minds of the American people. As if you believe in democracy, then presumably we want to take people's positions, whatever they are, and think about however the right way to aggregate those preferences. Of course, as a regular person, there are all kinds of I would like to change people's minds and hearts on lots of things, but as someone who believes in democracy, I don't have any desire to wave the wand and say, suppose that people had all of my more enlightened preferences, right?
Fair.
But if I thought about how to change the political system to allow moderates to compete, a big part of it would be to think about how can we get more moderates to run for office to begin with. And so so Andy Hall wrote a great book called Who Wants to Run, and he would be a great person to talk to if you haven't done so already.
Oh, thank you.
And he has some great reforms in mind, like what if we just paid them more money? What if we implemented campaign finance reforms so that politicians don't spend all of their time raising money, they actually spend their time working on policy. And you could think of a lot of reforms along those lines to think about how could we make this a more attractive job for high quality people, for many of whom are going to be more moderate than the people who run for Congress now. And so that's one set of reforms. You could also think about reforms to the electoral system. We talked about the first past the post system that we have now, which makes it really hard for people to vote for a third party candidate because they're worried about the coordination problem. They don't want to waste their vote. You don't want to waste your vote voting for a pro when you think essentially the election is going to come down to one of them, a Democrat or Republican. And so there are different ways of solving that problem. You could, for example, have something like a ranked choice system where people rank their choices. And then you could use something like Condorcet voting, where you say, let's compute all the head-to-head matchups. Let's see, does A beat B in the head-to-head race? And does B beat C? And what about A versus C? And And if any one candidate beats all the others in a head-to-head matchup, that's the winner. And I think moderates would do really well in the system because a moderate candidate, even if there are a lot of extremists out there, a moderate candidate would still often beat the extremists in a head-to-head matchup. And that would probably be the more desirable outcome from a democratic perspective is let's identify the candidate that would beat all the alternatives in a head-to-head matchup.
That's interesting. That's interesting. I've heard a lot of people come to that ranked choice voting, and I've also heard multi-party systems. The most of the democracies in the world that allied countries have to America are not the winner-take-all binary system we have in America. They're multi-party systems where you have to have a coalition government. And as I've said many times, more to ad nauseum, even when America set up democracies in Afghanistan and Iraq, we did not establish the form we have. We established the form most of the rest of the world does, multi-party coalition system. So seems to be the way democracy works best, according to most people out there doing it, and not our system. Yeah, absolutely. Can
I'll
we
add
get
one more reform that I like. And as a general rule, I'm not an advocate for policy reforms. I'm mostly trying to study these things in an objective
fair
way.
enough? Fair
Also
enough. Fair enough.
about what could help the system perform better. I am fairly sympathetic to compulsory voting, which is something that
Ah,
they do in Australia and
yes.
lots of other places. I think of voting as a collective action problem, which is that we as a society would be better off if everybody voted, but none of us individually has a strong incentive to vote because one vote isn't likely to make a difference. And the way we normally solve these collective action problems is through some kind of compulsion. And I think that would also probably, I would guess that probably would likely mitigate polarization a little bit because it would mean that the moderates are even more represented. They would show up and vote in higher numbers, and politicians would have a stronger incentive to cater to those moderate voters who otherwise might just stay home because they're not happy with any of the options.
I've heard that the Australian system, where everybody in Australia basically has to vote or you get fined, and they seem to have a lot more moderate candidates simply because everybody's voting. So the politicians who run know they have to appeal to the widest possible base. They're not just trying to get their boosters excited so they can get as much money in donations before the other guys. That surprisingly, I've been thinking about that. I think that might work. My concern is that I see a lot of people say, well, we just need to get more voters engaged. And that strikes me as making more people partisan. I view the Australian system as different. You're not telling voters just get more engaged. You're saying everybody's going to be forced to vote. You could be engaged, you could not be engaged, but you're all going to vote. And that kind of forces the politicians to go, well, I got to speak to everybody. So I could see the Australian system working. I'm concerned that there's not enough discussion separating that from the general stance of if we just had more people vote and more people get engaged. Because what I see is that's just going to make it worse with polarization. You need to be as excited and upset about the election as the guy down the street.
Right.
Now we just have everybody pissed off versus the Australian system. If you could actually get it passed, it seems to have a lot of promise, and a lot of people seem to say that. And there hasn't been very many people who've been able to poke holes in it. It looks promising. Can we get the American government to pass an amendment to force Australian style voting? I think is the big question.
Sure. Yeah, I think for any kind of electoral reform, politically it's very hard to pull off because the people who are voting on it, they benefited from the previous system. They don't have a strong incentive to change it. And and at least one political party is probably going to think that they're the net loser and this is going to benefit one party a little bit more than the other party and so forth. So I think it's very hard to implement any kind of major electoral reforms, but it has happened before and it could happen again. I think a constitutional amendment supporting compulsory voting is not going to happen in our lifetimes, but you could imagine it happening in other ways. You could imagine it starting at the local level. That suppose a county passes compulsory voting for their county in statewide elections, and that actually incentivizes other counties to do the same thing because they say, "Oh man, Lake County says we're losing out to Cook County in these elections because Cook County passed compulsory voting, so we should do the same thing." And then all of a sudden, Will County does the same thing, and so on. And pretty soon, every county in Illinois has compulsory voting. So that could be one way it arises. And of course, it would be contentious. It would go to courts. it would be a long drawn out thing, but it's not completely, inconceivable that something like that could happen.
One of the last questions I wanted to ask you is about this paper you've done on primary elections. Do primary elections exacerbate congressional polarization? We found no evidence that members of Congress vote in more extreme or partisan ways in order to deter primary challengers. I've seen a variety of debate where people say, if we get rid of the primary system, it's going to get rid of this extreme polarization. I've also seen some evidence saying that's just a popular myth people have. There's no real evidence that says primaries are what's causing polarization in America. How do you come out on this, Professor?
Yeah, I think it's a tricky question. So one thing you'd want to ask anybody is if they said, "Oh, we should get rid of primaries to mitigate polarization," you'd want to follow up and say, "With what are you replacing primaries? You have to have some other method for, say, nominating candidates or some other preferred electoral system, and those other alternatives could also have their own concerns." So in the U.S., before we had primaries, we had party conventions, and there are some states where the party conventions really, that is really the important place where nomination decisions occur. And most likely the party convention, the party leaders in those conventions are even more extreme than the voters in primaries, and so those might have even more of a polarizing effect than primaries. There's a lot of good research on this, and most of the evidence suggests that primaries do not exacerbate polarization as much as people think.
Interesting.
Part of that is that even the people who are voting in primaries are not generally as extreme as the elected officials running for office. And extremists don't systematically do better in partisan primaries. So that's one part of it. That's the kind of effort on the selection side. In this study here, my co-author and I, Shu Fu and I, are studying the incentive side, which is that once you're already in Congress, do you vote in a more extreme way because you're worried about losing in a primary election? And the way that we try to get at that is by taking advantage of the fact that different states have primaries at different times. And so we can look at two members from the same party who are casting a roll call vote on the same bill, but for one of them, their primary election has already passed, and for the other one, their primary election hasn't happened yet. And we find very modest effects. We find that, yes, there are some effects that go in the expected direction, that before your primary has come up, you are slightly more partisan or slightly more ideologically extreme, but it's a very small effect that can explain maybe 1% of the polarization in Congress. So most of the evidence suggests that primaries per se are not significantly driving or exacerbating congressional polarization. And if you replace primaries with something else like party conventions, you might actually make it worse.
That's awesome. If you replace primary voting with party conventions, you may make it worse. Please. I've been seeing that. I've been seeing a lot of, well, if we just do this, it'll fix this. And I go, is anybody thinking about making it worse with the solutions that we have? I had read a book called Fault Lines by Professor Cruz. I forget the other gentleman's name. And they were saying a lot of the reason that we have political polarization now is because they made these reforms in the 70s about Nixon. They said, well, we don't want another president like Nixon doing that. So they made a bunch of changes and put more power into the party's hands. And that even allowed the polarization we are here now. So I'm wondering, like, are we thinking through these changes we make and what long-term effects they may have? And do we just make the problem even worse? So when I hear you say replacing the primary voting with party convention may make it worse, that's wow. Okay. That's pretty extreme. Well, yeah, that was my last question I had. Is there anything that you wanted to ask or you wanted to say and you felt you didn't have the opportunity to?
No, I don't think so. We covered a lot. This was a fun conversation. And again, I don't have all of the answers. Like, I don't have the easy solutions to how to make the political system better or reduce polarization. But I do think that we talked a lot about the moderate voters and how much they're contributing, and I think in some ways it's unfair to place too much of the blame on the voters. The voters and the citizens themselves are not nearly as ideologically extreme as people think. And when given a moderate option, they typically select it. So I wouldn't say it's the fault of the regular Americans that we see so much polarization in Congress today, in Washington today, and in our political discourse. But of course, there's a lot more to talk about, in terms of what's going on. Maybe I'll share one other interesting finding, which is that the typical member of Congress today represents a constituency that is much more partisan than they used to. And
Thank
a
you.
lot of that is because of the geographic polarization. Most of that seems to be that people are moving around and the cities are becoming increasingly democratic. That's a very important trend that I think is underappreciated or hasn't gone as much as noticed as it should. And I think that's partly driving a lot of these patterns. Is that um, you see Democrats increasingly representing only rich, educated people who live in cities, Republicans representing rural people, and I think that is explaining a lot of what's going on, even though the people in the cities and the people in the rural areas they're not really happy about what's going on. But I think that's also one of these interesting phenomena that is having big effects on our politics.
So is the big sort real? People have sorted themselves ideologically over the last couple of decades, and that's part of the problem why we're seeing such extreme polarization. Is that it's uh, rural communities are almost all conservative, and urban communities are almost all liberal. Of course, there's exceptions, but in general, looking in generally, since the year 2000 to now, it's only seemed to sorted geographically. You're mentioning that here in that paper. Would it be fair to say that that geographic sorting is, if not the cause, it's definitely a big contributor to polarization today? Would that be a fair statement?
Yes, I agree. I agree. It's definitely happening. It's increasing, and I do believe it's a big contributor to elite polarization. One other little caveat is that
Please, please.
I mean, I don't think it's because people are moving for explicitly partisan reasons. I don't
Thank
think
you.
there are a lot of people who are saying, I only want to live around other Republicans, and so I'm going to move to a rural area and vice versa. That might be some people, but I think it's a very small fraction of people. I think it's probably other interesting social and economic changes that are causing this. I think the sorting is also stronger for Democrats than it is for Republicans. You'll find urban areas that are 90+% Democratic. You'll be hard pressed to find any part of the country that is 90+% Republican. So even the places that you think of as Republican are more mixed than the cities are Democratic. And that's actually, I mean, that also has implications for things like redistricting. That's a huge disadvantage for Democrats when it comes to redistricting because the Democrats are clumped together in cities and the Republicans are more dispersed. They're living in places that are kind of a mix of Democrats and Republicans. So anyway, there's a lot more interesting to say about that, but I agree that's a big change and that is causing a lot of polarization.
I've heard about the big sword. Thank you for confirming. Always want to test. I've never heard anybody bring it up that the sorting is stronger for Democrats than Republicans. That's fascinating. I would have just naturally assumed it was the opposite, because that's all we hear about is, Republicans wanting to peel off and they don't want to hang out with liberals anymore. But to actually hear, well, yeah, but when we look at sorting, there's at least a little bit more on the left than on the right. Wow. Uh, can we last theoretical question I'll ask, Professor, and thank you so much for taking the time to try to explain this to the public. Can we undo sorting that's been going on for decades?
Gosh, I don't know. I think it's probably really hard. I'm sure there are things that you could do to mitigate that, but I think that's really hard. One way it could change would be if the political parties change their platforms a bit. It seems to me like the Democrats are increasingly catering to a narrow subset of mostly rich, educated people who live in cities. And I mean, that's a whole other fascinating topic to discuss. Maybe that's for a whole other show. But the Democrats have largely abandoned what you might think of as economically progressive policies, and instead they're pushing for things like student loan relief and subsidies for electric vehicles and so forth, which again, I mean, some people really like, some people don't, but they're largely catering to people, they're catering to educated people who live in cities. And I think that's probably a losing strategy for them in the long run. I don't think you can win a lot of national elections by largely catering to educated people who live in cities. And if that changed, then that could change this kind of geographic polarization thing as well. You would see less of that. You'd see less of that sorting on that dimension.
That's another great point. And just for everybody at home, I love these interviews because I always learn something. I would not have guessed that. Everybody's saying the Republicans don't want to recognize minorities. They're shifting their focus to be more myopic focus just on Caucasian people. I haven't heard somebody say, well, you know what? The Democrats are kind of doing the same thing. And they add that to the, we're looking at the Democrats and they're sorting as much. That backs it up because I've long suspected that there was more of a preference in academia, I'm not sure, to say, it's all the Republicans' fault. They did everything wrong. They did all this stuff. Everybody who needs to change is them. Everybody on the left is doing just fine. We don't need to make any changes. Right, exactly. And I thought that doesn't happen in reality. Even when couples fight, there's both sides did something. Maybe there's one side who's more aggressive, but neither side was a complete saint and never did anything wrong ever. Now we're hearing some of the evidence. We do have to have both sides make changes. It's not just a problem on the right. Some people on the left are helping create polarization, and it will take all Americans on both sides to get us out of this. Would that be fair?
I think that's right. And I mean, the other thing to add is there's a big opportunity for either party. I think both parties are pretty out of touch with the average American right now. And there's a huge opportunity if either one of those parties could get their act together, they could win a ton of elections. It's not that hard actually, because there's so much room. There's so much room to moderate and win those elections. And I think part of the problem is that the party leaders themselves just don't care that much. They might be so extreme themselves that they're willing to give up seats in Congress in exchange for ideological purity. They've got their own motivations and their own bases that they're catering to. But there is a huge opportunity there, which is if either party can get its act together and say, okay, let's offer some moderate policy positions that are closer to where the average American is, they would clean up in national elections. And that would kind of force the other party to respond and do the same thing. And so that would be one way of getting out of this dilemma a little bit, would be for somebody in the parties to wise up and say, we're leaving a bunch of seats on the table here. We could actually make people's lives better and implement better policies and win more elections while we're at it, if only we moderated a bit.
There's some evidence of that. I remember the George W. Bush elections with Al Gore. George W. Bush started talking about restoring American values, and then Al Gore started talking about it. So you had both parties started to shift gradually to go, this is something Americans care about. We'll both cover that. And then gay rights. Gay rights used to be a very polarizing issue. Republicans I said the word seem, okay, don't give me phone calls afterwards, seem to be backing away from that. And it seems to be less of an issue as it was 10 years ago, where you're like, oh, you're pro-gay rights, you're definitely a liberal. It's a little more muddy. So we can't have people seem to gradually embrace a common identity for both parties and move in there. Okay. I would definitely love to have you back. Would you ever be willing to come back?
Sure, this is fun. I enjoyed it, and yeah, there's more to say. Maybe we should save it for another day because this is really fun.
Absolutely. Okay, perfect. Last two questions. You're not you. You're not me. You're a third person watching this video. Boy, did they learn a lot. They're watching it a week from now, and they're going, boy, I learned a lot. I didn't know Democrats did this. I didn't know Democrats. Wow, challenging my assumptions. And they're struggling to remember it all, but they go, there was this one thing the professor said, and I can't get it out of my head when I struggle to remember the rest of the show clearly. What is that one thought you want an imaginary person you'll never actually meet to be able to stop thinking 5 days after they finish watching this interview?
The elites are really polarized, but the public is not.
Do you want to expound? Or is that basically the takeaway is, hey guys, yes, we have had elite polarization. Yes, it goes back to the 1970s, but don't assume that means us, the people.
Yeah, I think that's good. I think that's right. I'm happy to stop there.
Okay. Okay. You don't have to, but we always ask, do you have any recommendations? They could be an academic, they could just be an activist, they could be anyone you know. Anybody who'd be willing to be part of this conversation. You don't have to, but we always try to keep the conversation going.
Recommendations for, sorry, for,
For somebody who you know who might be open for an interview on political polarization.
oh, for other interviews. I see.
Anyone that you know who might, be interested or a good talk. And, it could be someone in academia, someone not in academia, a local school teacher, somebody you're going, Joe Bob, that guy really's got some interesting thoughts. You should talk to him, whoever that is.
Sure. Yeah, I mentioned Andy Hall. He's at
Yep.
Stanford, the co-author of mine, and he's done some great work on these topics. So
Done.
certainly he would be of interest. I have a lot of great co-authors in some of these papers who would also have a lot to add. And
That's
so
a good point.
some of them would have interesting things to say that I wouldn't necessarily think to say. Um, and I think on the political side, I'll say I enjoy talking to practitioners who have been around for a long time and can talk about how things have changed. They'll have a different perspective than I will have, and they maybe haven't looked at the same data, but they have really interesting personal experiences. I'll mention one person who's a fun person to talk to. His name's Mark Farinella, and he's affiliated with the Harris School, so I work with him in some capacity. He was chief of staff for Mel Carnahan in Missouri. He's a political organizer, campaign person, but just been around for a long time and can talk a little bit about these kinds of issues we talked about, like why does it seem like the elites have changed which kinds of people they recruit for office?
Right.
So he might be a fun person to talk to, and I'm sure he'll have some interesting views. Maybe I'll also mention, since you're a California person, I'll mention my friend Raul Campillo, who's on the city council in San Diego. He's a very smart guy, and he's a Democrat on the city council in San Diego. But I think trying to be a very serious, moderate, pragmatic city council member who's actually trying to implement policies that are good for everyone in San Diego, not just for Democrats and not just for liberals. And so he might be a fun person to talk to as well. I learn a lot from him every time I talk to him.
How do you spell his name?
Campillo, Campillo.
Okay. And his first name is Raul?
Raul.
Raul. Okay. Got it. And what was Mark's last name?
Farinella, Farinella.
Oh, thank you so much. And I'm definitely going to reach out to all your study co-authors, because all these papers were definitely on political polarization. We're trying to reach out to everybody. I really appreciate that. I will email you shortly with a copy of the video. I want to say thank you for your time. I want to say thank you for being willing to handle experimental questions. I know it's outside the wheelhouse for professors. You're typically trained to only speak about what the data shows, but these conversations really help the public to digest this material. And there's a lot of unknowns out there. And this was a good conversation. This helps the public grab some knowledge and some data and help just digest it fully, more than I think they can get elsewhere. So I really appreciate your time, and I want to say thank you for coming out.
Thank you so much. It was great to talk to you.
I will email you a copy shortly, and I'll talk to you soon about another interview.
Okay, that sounds great. Okay, see you.